August 7, 1983, and the White River flowed lazy and brown through northeastern Arkansas, its banks lined with cypress trees and fishing spots where locals came to escape the oppressive summer heat that hung over the region. The old Johnson Bridge crossed the river about 3 miles outside the town of Riverside, a single-lane steel structure built in 1947 that connected 2 rural county roads and was popular with fishermen who cast their lines from its edges. Caleb Randall Henson was 8 years old that Sunday afternoon, a lanky boy with dark curly hair, brown eyes, and a gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled, and he loved fishing more than almost anything else. He wore a white t-shirt with a Base Fish logo, denim shorts with a hole in one pocket, red sneakers that were getting too small for his growing feet, and a blue baseball cap that had belonged to his father. Caleb lived with his parents, Thomas and Marie Henson, on a small farm about 2 miles from the Johnson Bridge, and fishing the White River had been his favorite summer activity since he was old enough to hold a pole. That afternoon, Caleb had begged his father to take him fishing, and Thomas agreed because his work on the farm was finished for the day, and the August heat made the cool river breeze sound appealing. They arrived at the bridge parking area at 2:30 p.m., just a gravel clearing with space for maybe 4 vehicles, and 2 other trucks were already there belonging to fishermen who'd claimed spots along the riverbank below. Thomas and Caleb walked onto the bridge carrying their tackle box and poles, and they set up near the middle where the water was deepest and the current created eddies where catfish liked to hide. For almost an hour they fished peacefully while the sun beat down and cicadas buzzed in the trees, and Caleb caught 2 small bream that he carefully released back into the water after admiring them. "Dad, I need to use the bathroom," Caleb said around 3:40 p.m., shifting from foot to foot in the way children do when nature calls urgently, and Thomas looked around at the rural landscape with no facilities anywhere. "Go behind those trees over there," Thomas said, pointing to a cluster of willows about 50 yards from the bridge on the south side. "But stay where I can see you and come right back. Don't wander off." Caleb nodded and handed his fishing pole to his father before jogging off the bridge toward the trees, and Thomas watched him disappear into the willow cluster before turning his attention back to his line. A fish hit Thomas's hook within seconds, a good-sized catfish that fought hard, and Thomas focused on reeling it in carefully so the line wouldn't break, a process that took maybe 3 or 4 minutes. When Thomas finally landed the catfish and looked up toward the willows expecting to see Caleb returning, his son wasn't there, and the afternoon suddenly felt wrong in a way Thomas couldn't immediately articulate. "Caleb," Thomas called, setting down his pole and walking toward the willows. "Time to come back, buddy, I caught a big one." But no response came from the trees that stood silent in the August heat. Thomas reached the willow cluster and found it empty, just trees and undergrowth in the riverbank beyond, and his heart began beating faster as he called Caleb's name louder and with growing urgency. In less than 5 minutes, while his father's attention was focused on landing a fish, 8-year-old Caleb Henson vanished from a spot 50 yards away in broad daylight on a quiet Sunday afternoon. If you're hooked on this mystery, subscribe to the channel for more unsolved cases, hit that like button and comment where you're watching from, or what theories you have about Caleb. Now let's see what happened next. Thomas ran along the riverbank in both directions calling for Caleb, checking behind every tree and bush, looking for any sign of his son's white shirt or blue baseball cap, but finding nothing except empty forest. He ran back to the bridge and shouted to the other fishermen downstream, asking if they'd seen a boy in a white shirt, and both men said they'd been focused on their lines and hadn't noticed anyone. Thomas sprinted to his truck and drove the 2 miles home faster than he'd ever driven, praying that somehow Caleb had walked home along the road, though he knew that made no sense because he would have seen him. Marie was working in the garden when Thomas's truck came skidding into the driveway, and she knew immediately from his face that something terrible had happened, and her hands dropped the tomatoes she'd been picking. "Caleb's gone," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "We were fishing and he went behind some trees and he just disappeared. I can't find him anywhere. We need to call the police right now." The Riverside Police Department consisted of a sheriff and 3 deputies covering the entire county, and Sheriff Dale Morrison received the call at 4:15 p.m. and immediately drove to the Johnson Bridge with 2 deputies. Thomas showed them exactly where Caleb had gone into the willows and exactly where he'd been standing on the bridge, and the deputies began searching the immediate area while Sheriff Morrison radioed for additional help. The riverbank where Caleb had disappeared showed no signs of struggle, no disturbed earth or broken branches, just normal forest floor that revealed nothing about what had happened to an 8-year-old boy. Search and rescue teams arrived from 3 neighboring counties within 2 hours, bringing tracking dogs and river patrol boats, and the operation expanded quickly as daylight began fading toward evening. The dogs picked up Caleb's scent easily from the baseball cap Thomas had kept in the truck, and they tracked directly to the willow cluster where Caleb had gone to use the bathroom. But then the trail became confused and scattered. "The dogs are picking up multiple directions," the lead handler told Sheriff Morrison. "It's like the scent goes everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I've never seen them this disoriented on a fresh trail." The scent trail led briefly toward the river, then seemed to double back toward the road, then went into the woods, and the dogs kept circling and whining as if they couldn't make sense of what their noses were telling them. River patrol boats searched both upstream and downstream from the bridge, dragging hooks and checking areas where a child might have fallen in, though the water near the willows was shallow and slow-moving, not the kind that could sweep someone away. Divers went down in the deeper sections near the bridge pilings, checking for any sign that Caleb had somehow ended up in the water, despite being 50 yards from the river's edge when he'd disappeared. Thomas stood on the bridge watching the search efforts while blaming himself with every breath, replaying those 3 or 4 minutes when he'd been focused on landing a fish instead of watching his son like he'd promised. Marie arrived at the bridge at 6 p.m. and had to be physically restrained from jumping into the river to search herself, screaming Caleb's name until her voice went hoarse while deputies tried to calm her down. "He's 8 years old and he's terrified of the dark," Marie sobbed to Sheriff Morrison. "We have to find him before nightfall, please. He'll be so scared out there alone when it gets dark." Volunteers from Riverside and surrounding communities began arriving as word spread about the missing boy, and by 7 p.m. over 100 people were involved in the search spreading out from the Johnson Bridge. The 2 fishermen who'd been downstream were interviewed extensively, and both insisted they'd seen and heard nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of the river and birds and nothing that suggested a child in distress. One fisherman named Earl Thompson mentioned that he'd seen a faded blue pickup truck drive across the bridge around 3:30 p.m., moving slowly like the driver was looking for something, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. "Did you see the driver or get a plate number?" Sheriff Morrison asked urgently, and Earl shook his head saying he'd barely glanced at it because trucks crossed that bridge all the time and it hadn't seemed noteworthy. This detail sent deputies scrambling to find anyone else who might have seen the blue truck, and roadblocks were set up on both county roads hoping to catch it if it came back through the area. Search teams with powerful flashlights continued working through the night, calling Caleb's name and checking every ditch and culvert and abandoned structure within a 5-mile radius of the bridge. Helicopters from the Arkansas State Police joined the search at first light on Monday morning, flying grid patterns over the dense forest that surrounded the river and using thermal imaging to search for heat signatures. The White River was dragged more extensively in daylight, with boats working in coordinated patterns checking every possible location where a body might have sunk or snagged, but they found nothing related to Caleb. Caleb's description was broadcast on every radio and television station in Arkansas. 8 years old, dark curly hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing white t-shirt with Bass logo, denim shorts, red sneakers, and blue baseball cap. The FBI was contacted Monday afternoon, and agents arrived from the Little Rock field office bringing expertise in child abduction cases and access to national databases that rural Arkansas law enforcement didn't have. Agent Robert Chen reviewed all the evidence and focused immediately on the blue pickup truck that Earl Thompson had seen, because the timing coincided almost exactly with when Caleb had disappeared. If someone in that truck saw a child alone near the trees, they had maybe a 2 or 3 minute window to grab him before the father would notice, Chen explained to Sheriff Morrison. This theory suggested abduction rather than a child getting lost or injured, and it meant Caleb could be anywhere by now, possibly hundreds of miles from Arkansas if the truck had kept driving. Roadblocks were expanded to cover a wider area, and descriptions of blue pickup trucks were circulated to law enforcement across multiple states, but thousands of similar trucks existed in rural Arkansas alone, making the search nearly impossible. By Tuesday morning, Caleb had been missing for over 40 hours, and the search radius expanded to cover 100 square miles of forest, farmland, and river country, with over 300 volunteers involved. Thomas and Marie appeared on local television pleading for Caleb's return, with Marie holding one of his teddy bears and begging whoever had her son to please let him go somewhere safe. "He's just a little boy who loves fishing and playing with his dog," Marie said through tears. "He wouldn't hurt anyone. Please, if you have him, just drop him off at a store or church. We just want him home." The plea was broadcast across Arkansas and neighboring states, and tips began flooding the sheriff's department with people reporting sightings of boys matching Caleb's description in various locations. Every tip was investigated no matter how unlikely or distant, with deputies driving hundreds of miles to check reports that consistently ended in disappointment when the child wasn't Caleb or didn't exist at all. A woman in Memphis called saying she'd seen a boy matching Caleb's description at a truck stop, with a man who seemed nervous, but security footage showed the child was with his legitimate father traveling home from vacation. A store clerk in Oklahoma reported a boy in red sneakers who seemed scared, but when police arrived they found a family shopping normally with no connection whatsoever to the missing Arkansas child. The blue pickup truck became an obsession for investigators who checked registration records for every blue truck in a 6-county area, interviewing owners, and verifying their locations on August 7th between 3:30 and 4 p.m. One truck owner named Vernon Hayes, who lived 15 miles from the Johnson Bridge, couldn't provide a solid alibi for that afternoon, saying he'd been driving around looking at property but had no witnesses to confirm his story. Hayes became a person of interest, and his truck was processed by forensic teams who spent days examining every inch of the vehicle looking for evidence that Caleb had been inside, but they found nothing conclusive. Hayes agreed to multiple polygraph tests and passed them consistently, showing no deception when he said he'd never seen Caleb Henson and hadn't been near the Johnson Bridge that day, but suspicion lingered anyway. The Henson family received cruel prank calls from people claiming to have Caleb or demanding ransom, and each call sent Marie into hysterics before police traced them to teenagers or mentally ill individuals with no actual information. Search efforts continued for 3 weeks with decreasing intensity, as the likelihood of finding Caleb alive diminished with each passing day, and eventually, the daily operations were scaled back to weekend volunteer searches. Thomas stopped working on the farm and spent every day driving back roads and checking abandoned buildings, and talking to anyone who might have seen something, running himself into physical and mental exhaustion. Marie couldn't function at all, spending days in bed staring at Caleb's empty room across the hall, and her sister moved in to take care of her because she'd stopped eating and sleeping, and was deteriorating visibly. The Johnson Bridge became a site of pilgrimage for the community, with people leaving flowers and teddy bears and handwritten prayers, and the willows where Caleb had disappeared took on an almost sacred quality. Local newspapers ran daily updates for the first month, then weekly updates, then occasional features on anniversaries, and gradually Caleb's story faded from front pages as new tragedies demanded attention. By October, the case was officially designated as cold, with no active leads being pursued, and Sheriff Morrison admitted in a press conference that without new evidence, they'd exhausted every investigative avenue available. The admission devastated the Henson family, who'd been clinging to hope that professional searchers would find something the volunteers had missed, and accepting the case was cold felt like giving up on Caleb. Agent Chen returned to Little Rock but continued working the case in his spare time, comparing Caleb's disappearance to other missing children cases in the region, looking for patterns that might connect them. Between 1980 and 1985, 4 children had vanished from rural areas in Arkansas and surrounding states under circumstances that shared disturbing similarities. Brief windows when parents were distracted, locations near water, and no physical evidence. None of those cases had been solved, and Chen suspected they might be connected to the same perpetrator, someone who traveled rural areas looking for opportunities and knew how to avoid leaving traces. The theory was compelling but unprovable without evidence, and presenting it to the Henson family would only add to their pain by suggesting Caleb's disappearance was part of a larger pattern they were powerless to stop. By 1984, Caleb's case was featured on regional crime shows and missing children programs, generating new tips that all led nowhere, and the family's hope began transforming into resigned grief as months became years. Thomas and Marie's marriage deteriorated under the strain, with Thomas becoming withdrawn and silent while Marie oscillated between denial and overwhelming despair, and they existed in the same house like ghosts haunting separate rooms. Caleb's younger sister Emma, who'd been only 5 when he disappeared, grew up in the shadow of her missing brother, with his absence defining her childhood and making her parents unable to be fully present for her. The blue pickup truck was never conclusively identified despite hundreds of interviews and vehicle inspections, and it became one more frustrating dead end in a case full of questions with no answers. Psychics contacted the family offering visions of where Caleb might be, with one claiming he was near a red barn and another insisting he was underground in a dark place, and desperate Marie listened to all of them. Sheriff Morrison followed up on the psychic tips even though he knew they were likely worthless, because he couldn't bear the thought of leaving any possibility unexplored, no matter how unlikely it seemed. None of the psychic visions led to anything real, and Morrison came to resent the people who preyed on grieving families with false hope while pretending to have supernatural knowledge they clearly didn't possess. The Arkansas State Police periodically reviewed the case file looking for overlooked details or new angles, and each review ended with the same conclusion. Without physical evidence or witnesses, the case was unsolvable. The 1990s brought advances in forensic technology and national databases for missing children, and age progression photos showed what Caleb might look like at 13, then 16, then 18 as he theoretically grew into adulthood. Each new photo was distributed through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and posted in truck stops and police stations across the country. But Caleb remained among the vanished with no credible sightings. Thomas Henson became obsessed with searching abandoned properties and remote areas throughout Arkansas, convinced that if Caleb's body was somewhere to be found, he would be the one to find it through sheer determination. He spent weekends driving hundreds of miles checking old barns and hunting cabins and forgotten wells, and neighbors worried he was losing his grip on reality as the years passed without bringing him any closer to answers. Marie found solace in support groups for parents of missing children, connecting with others who understood the specific torture of not knowing, and these connections kept her functional when grief threatened to destroy her completely. The couple divorced in 1995 after 12 years of trying to survive together, both acknowledging that they reminded each other too much of what they'd lost and couldn't heal while living in the same house. Thomas stayed in Arkansas, unable to leave the area where Caleb had disappeared, while Marie moved to Little Rock where she worked with missing children advocacy groups and helped other families navigate their nightmares. Emma Henson left Arkansas at 18 and rarely looked back, carrying trauma from growing up as the forgotten child in a family consumed by grief over her missing brother, and she rarely spoke about her childhood. New investigators periodically took over cold cases including Caleb's file, and each one reviewed the evidence hoping to find something previous detectives had missed, but the Johnson Bridge yielded no new secrets. In 2001, human remains were discovered in a wooded area, about 40 miles from Riverside, and Thomas received the call that made his world stop as he waited for forensic analysis to determine if they'd finally found Caleb. The bones belonged to an adult male who'd been dead for at least 20 years, not an 8-year-old boy, and Thomas experienced the crushing disappointment of renewed hope followed by devastating confirmation that the search must continue. Sheriff Morrison retired in 2003 after 30 years in law enforcement, and he admitted at his retirement party that Caleb Henson's case was the one that haunted him most, the failure that kept him awake at night. "I've worked hundreds of cases, but that little boy at the bridge is the one I see when I close my eyes," Morrison told the gathered crowd. "Somewhere someone knows what happened, and it kills me that we never found them." New technology in the 2000s allowed investigators to re-examine evidence with DNA testing and digital enhancement of old photographs, but the minimal physical evidence from 1983 had degraded beyond usefulness or never existed in the first place. The blue pickup truck remained an unidentified ghost, possibly connected to Caleb's disappearance or possibly just a coincidence, and without finding the vehicle or its driver, that question would never be answered. True crime internet forums became fascinated with Caleb's case in the 2010s, with amateur investigators analyzing every detail and proposing theories ranging from logical to fantastical about what had happened near the Johnson Bridge. Some believed Caleb had been grabbed by someone in the blue truck who'd been stalking fishing areas looking for vulnerable children, while others thought he'd wandered into the river and his body had been carried downstream beyond where searches had focused. A few suggested more elaborate scenarios involving underground trafficking networks or serial killers operating in rural Arkansas, but none of these theories could be proven without evidence that simply didn't exist. Thomas Henson died in 2016 at age 68 from complications related to liver disease brought on by decades of alcohol abuse and depression, and his obituary mentioned that he was survived by his missing son, Caleb. Marie attended the funeral and stood at Thomas's grave knowing that he died without ever learning what happened to their boy, and she wondered if she would die the same way, forever wondering and never knowing. The composite description of the blue pickup truck and its unknown driver had been viewed by millions of people over the decades through television programs and internet posts, but nobody had ever come forward with definitive identification. Agent Chen, long retired from the FBI, still kept a copy of Caleb's file and periodically reviewed it, looking for connections he might have missed, convinced that the answer was there somewhere, if he could just see it correctly. In 2018, advanced genealogical DNA technology offered new hope for identifying unknown remains, and investigators collected DNA samples from Marie to create a profile that could be compared against databases of unidentified bodies. But no matches came back from state or federal databases, meaning either Caleb was still alive somewhere, or his remains had never been discovered and entered into the system, and both possibilities were equally painful. The Johnson Bridge underwent renovation in 2020, and during construction, workers searched the area thoroughly, hoping that disturbed earth might reveal something that had been hidden, but they found nothing related to the missing boy. By 2023, Caleb Henson would have been 48 years old, possibly with a career and family of his own, living a life that existed only in the imagination of those who'd known him as an 8-year-old boy who loved fishing. Marie Henson, now 76 and struggling with health issues related to decades of stress and grief, kept every age progression photo ever created displayed in her Little Rock apartment, a gallery of faces that might exist somewhere. She checked missing persons databases compulsively despite knowing the likelihood of finding answers after 40 years was statistically almost zero, but hope was the only thing that had kept her alive through the decades of not knowing. The Arkansas State Police Cold Case Unit reviewed Caleb's file in 2022 as part of a comprehensive initiative examining unsolved cases from the 1980s, applying modern investigative techniques and databases to evidence that had been collected before digital technology existed. Detective Amanda Foster spent 3 months on the case, tracking down every witness who was still alive and re-examining the physical evidence with fresh eyes. But she ultimately reached the same frustrating conclusions as every investigator before her. "The evidence is what it is," Foster told her supervisor. "A child disappeared in a matter of minutes from a location with limited witnesses, and without finding Caleb or identifying who took him, this case may never be solved." The willow cluster where Caleb had vanished had grown wild over the decades, the trees now tall and thick, and the spot had become part of local folklore with stories about strange occurrences that rational people dismissed. Some fishermen claimed to hear a child's voice calling from the willows when they visited the Johnson Bridge at dusk, while others reported seeing a figure in a blue cap near the riverbank, and most dismissed these accounts as imagination fueled by knowledge. But enough people reported similar experiences over the years that the area gained an unsettling reputation, and parents warned their children away from those particular willows, as if the trees themselves remembered what had happened there. Caleb's case remained a staple of true crime media, featured in podcasts and YouTube videos and documentary series that examined the evidence from every conceivable angle, but analysis couldn't change the fundamental absence of answers. Theories continued to evolve with each new generation of investigators and amateur sleuths. Abduction by a stranger in the blue truck, accidental drowning with the body swept far downstream, or something more sinister involving trafficking or serial predators. None of these theories could be definitively proven or disproven, and that uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the case, that every explanation remained simultaneously possible and unprovable without evidence or confession. The blue pickup truck driver, if he existed and was connected to Caleb's disappearance, had succeeded in committing what appeared to be a perfect crime, taking a child in broad daylight and leaving behind almost nothing except devastated family and unanswered questions. Emma Henson, now 45 and living in Colorado with minimal contact with her mother, still carried resentment about growing up in the shadow of her missing brother, though she understood intellectually that her parents' grief wasn't intentional neglect. "I lost my brother that day, but I also lost my parents," Emma told a therapist in 2021. "They were so consumed by searching for him that they forgot I was still there and needed them too." The Johnson Bridge itself was eventually replaced in 2022 with a modern 2-lane structure that could handle increased traffic, but the old steel bridge was preserved as a historic landmark and memorial to Caleb. A plaque was installed near the spot where Thomas had been fishing, reading "In memory of Caleb R. Henson, age 8, missing since August 7, 1983, May you find your way home. And people still left flowers there on the anniversary. Marie made the trip from Little Rock to Riverside every August 7th, despite the difficulty of travel and the pain the journey caused, because she couldn't let that date pass without standing where her son had last been seen. I know he's probably gone, Marie admitted to a reporter in 2023. I know 40 years is a long time and the chances are almost zero, but I can't give up completely because what if he's out there and I stopped looking? That stubborn hope, however unlikely, was what kept Marie going through the decades, and she'd told investigators she would search for Caleb until her dying breath, even though she knew the search was probably futile. The Arkansas State Police maintain Caleb's case file in their cold case division, and it's reviewed whenever new missing persons are reported or unidentified remains are discovered anywhere in the region. DNA samples remain on file and are automatically compared against every John Doe entered into national databases, and Caleb's dental records and physical description are flagged in systems that might someday produce a match. But as of today, more than 40 years after Caleb Henson walked behind willow trees near an Arkansas river bridge, his fate remains completely unknown, and his case remains frustratingly unsolved despite thousands of hours of investigation. Nobody knows if he's alive or dead, if he was taken by the driver of a blue pickup truck, or if something else entirely happened in those few minutes when his father was focused on landing a fish. The case stands as a reminder that some mysteries resist all attempts at solution, that sometimes the evidence is simply insufficient, and the truth remains hidden no matter how desperately people search for it. Somewhere, someone knows what happened to Caleb Henson on August 7, 1983, whether they were directly involved in his disappearance or witnessed something they never reported to authorities or discovered information they kept to themselves. Until that person comes forward, or until physical evidence emerges that can finally explain what happened near the Johnson Bridge, Caleb remains frozen in time as an 8-year-old boy in a white t-shirt and blue baseball cap. His story continues to haunt those who knew him and those who've only heard his name through true crime media, a reminder that children can vanish in moments, that evil can strike in the most ordinary circumstances, and that some families never get closure. And near the White River in Arkansas, where a new bridge has replaced the old and willow trees grow wild along the banks, the mystery of what happened to Caleb Henson endures as one of the state's most baffling unsolved cases. The fishing pole he'd handed to his father that August afternoon remained in the Henson garage for years after he disappeared, never used again, a silent testament to a Sunday fishing trip that ended in tragedy nobody could explain. And in the end, 40 years of investigation and searching and hoping and grieving have produced no answers, only more questions, and Caleb Henson remains missing, his case unsolved, his family still waiting for truth that may never come.